Court-ordered desegregation of the Boston Public Schools started in 1974. About 46 years later, two-thirds of the system's students of color go to schools that are intensely segregated. For many in Boston, that's hardly a surprise. But there's a new study looking beyond the pattern to the causes, including a system of accountability that was supposed to help narrow the achievement gap. Joining us is one of the study's authors and assistant professor of education at UMass Lowell, and he's also director of research with the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. We'd like to welcome Jack Schneider. Thank you very much for being with us, Jack.
Thanks for having me.
Jack, I want to look beyond the pattern and beyond the history here to what's coming down the road, because what you describe in the study is a pattern of increasing racial separation, looking beyond Boston, of course. Why is that such a problem?
It's such a problem because even as we've seen a decline in the number of predominantly white schools, we have seen an uptick in the number of schools where historically marginalized racial groups, so specifically Black students and Latinx students, are being isolated. And as historically marginalized groups, these students are the least likely to be given the resources that they need in order to have an equal education. So there are all kinds of problems with segregated schools. The most immediate of them is that if we want people to be able to live together in our society, they have to go to school together. But I think the real concern for these communities themselves is not that they go to school with each other, not that Black students go to school with Black students. Black families don't have a problem with that in many cases. It's that they are systematically denied resources when they are isolated from their more privileged counterparts.
Well, part of what's going on here matches up with what's been familiarized as the great sort, that is, choices made by the people with the most options. But what else do you see feeding into this?
One of the things that we identify in our report is the present accountability system, which really tends to reflect demography as strongly as anything else. And so people often look at the ratings produced by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and assume that what they are seeing there is a rating of school quality. And unfortunately, the present measures that are used correlate quite strongly with race, family income, and parental educational attainment. As a result, we often learn more about a school's demography by looking at these data than we do about school quality. And we see this play out in really troubling ways in the kinds of best schools lists produced by magazines like Boston Magazine or like The Globe, where they are essentially driving more privileged parents who have the ability to make choices about real estate towards whiter and more affluent school districts under the auspices of guiding them to better schools, when in fact they're really being guided to whiter schools and richer schools.
Well, what's getting lost? I've heard parents of color say very negative things about schools that happen to have low test scores, but on the other hand, there are other schools where I've heard really good things, and they're not written up in Boston Magazine. So how do you fix that?
Yeah, the solution is we actually need to begin measuring the things that people care about. Just because test scores are a highly imperfect measure of school quality does not mean that the opposite is true, that schools with high test scores are bad schools. What it means instead is that the vast majority of questions that people would like to have answered about schools are not being answered by present data systems. People want to know things like, how safe are kids in this school? How engaged are they? Do they have opportunities to explore the arts, to learn music? Do they have a chance to be creative in the classroom? Do they get along with each other? Are they developing as members of our larger polis? These are the kinds of things that parents and community members care about, and they certainly aren't going to learn anything about those things by looking at standardized test scores in two subject areas. People generally have much broader aims for public education than what can be measured by a machine grading a multiple choice test.
Well, one of the things we learned, at least from the early years of school desegregation in Boston, is that when you have schools that a lot of white parents perceive as inferior, they flee. How do you prevent that from happening now?
Yeah, one of the solutions is to systematically invest in schools so that people understand there aren't good schools and bad schools, that all of the schools are being funded and resourced in an equitable way. Now, I say equitable instead of equal because in some cases, some schools may require greater investments than others in order to advance the aim of equity. So that's one step. Another is to move past our very narrow and limited conversation about what makes a good school and begin as members of Greater Boston's community, as members of the Commonwealth, as members of the larger society in the United States, to begin having a conversation about what good schools do beyond privilege the already most privileged members of our society, right? I think that good schools bring young people from different backgrounds together. I think a lot of people agree with me, but that's not the way that we presently talk about school quality in our society, in our Commonwealth, or in our city.
What about things here in Boston? Because as it now stands, and I think you pointed this out in your study, there are some schools in the Boston district where I think the percentage of white students is close to 60. And I guess that says there's maybe a capacity for more schools to have more diversity if things were assigned differently, maybe.
Absolutely. So in the case of Boston specifically, the district dropped its racial makeup guidelines in 1999. And since then, we have seen an increase in segregation within the district. So students are more segregated in particular schools inside the district. And we see that this is not a problem that is specific to Boston. This is a problem across the Commonwealth and in fact across the United States, where if we aren't carefully attending to school integration, then what will happen is that because so many of our neighborhoods are segregated, our schools will become segregated, and these neighborhoods aren't segregated by accident. As scholars like Richard Rothstein have shown, those neighborhoods were segregated quite intentionally through policy. And so we need to use policy quite intentionally to desegregate. And if we can't desegregate our neighborhoods, and I think that's actually a long-term aim that we should all be focused on, but if we can't do that in the immediate future, one thing that we can do is think carefully about how to desegregate our schools. We found that 6 of the 9 districts in the Commonwealth that have intensely segregated schools could actually be uniformly diverse. Every school in the district could be racially diverse according to our criteria if they had adopted a plan to assign students in a manner that simply took demography into account to try to create balance across the schools in the district.
What about the benefits of integration? I think we have the classic example of Medco. Certainly a lot of parents who put their children in that program seem to be very satisfied with it, but even beyond Medco, what are the broad gains that you could look for?
There are lots of gains. Many are often described as being gains for students of color. Students of color, and particularly the most historically marginalized students, tend to benefit in terms of educational achievement and attainment. This goes on to reap benefits for them in terms of lifetime earnings. But all students benefit. And new research is also looking at the benefits to white students, because one of the ways that this conversation has been impoverished, in my opinion, over the past few decades is that it has been presented as a benefit for students of color that comes at the cost of the experiences or opportunities presented to white students. And that simply is not what the research indicates. The research indicates that all students benefit, or at least are not harmed by racially integrated schools. And in one forthcoming study that we have, we found that white students in many cases are often the most extreme beneficiaries of racially integrated schools, that they feel safer, more engaged, and happier in racially integrated schools. Now, this is not a causal study, it's a correlational one, so there may be other factors at play there. But the point is worth repeating that white students benefit tremendously from racially integrated schools. And I think the final point worth making about this is that we all stand to benefit from racially integrated schools because it stands to create a more racially balanced and cooperative society. And right now we see that we simply don't inhabit a society that you can describe that way right now.
One other byproduct of the system of accountability is we have a cycle of underperforming schools getting turned around and then going back downhill when resources are cut back. How about ways to break that cycle?
Yeah, one of the conversations that we often have in our consortium, the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment, and the Boston Public Schools are a member of our consortium, is the fact that if accountability really worked, if intervention really worked, then schools would look forward to state intervention so that they could improve. And that simply is not the case right now. Districts and schools will do whatever they can to avoid that kind of intervention. And while certainly a case could be made that that can drive a particular kind of improvement, the fact is that if a school doesn't have what it needs to succeed, it is not going to gain those elements through punishment or through a loss of the kinds of autonomies that are necessary for schools to succeed. So I would love to see a new approach to intervention that worked really on building the capacity of schools, not just through the infusion of resources, but also through the systematic empowerment of teachers, students, and community members so that they had better information, better systems for improving their schools, so that they had more time to work on school improvement efforts. And I think that a lot of that would be facilitated by a ratcheting down of the current test and punish regime.
Jack, finally, I know there's so much more that people might be interested in following you on between the report and your podcast. How can people connect with that?
So they can follow our work through the Beyond Test Scores project. I am on Twitter, usually focused on academic subjects at eduhistorian, that's edu_historian. And my podcast that I do with journalist Jennifer Berkshire is Have You Heard? And they can download that wherever they get their podcasts.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
Jack Schneider from UMass Lowell will have more news in just a moment.